Hi, and welcome to Let's Talk About Cities, a podcast dedicated to making complex topics in architecture and urban design more accessible. In this episode, we'll take a deeper dive into the countryside and its relation to the city. I'll start by introducing an overview of city and countryside through the lens of urbanization, and then I'll present some reports and research on the topic. After that, I'll go into some of the definitions and difference of the terms used, and then speak about a renewed interest for countryside within architectural discourse. I'll then finish with future outlooks. Let's talk about cities. The relationship between city and countryside has undergone significant changes since the Industrial Revolution. During the Industrial Revolution, cities experienced rapid growth as people migrated from rural areas to urban centers in search of employment in factories and in other industries. This led to the creation of large, densely populated cities, which became centers of innovation and commerce. As industrialization spread, the countryside also underwent significant changes. Many rural areas were transformed into agricultural production centers, with large farms and plantations replacing small family-owned plots. This led to the growth of agribusiness and the mechanization of agriculture, which had a major impact on the entire rural economy and its way of life. In the present day, the relationship between city and countryside is still marked by a contrast between urbanization and rural life. Cities continue to be centers of economic activity, with many people living and working in urban areas. And at the same time, however, there's been a resurgence of interest in rural living and a movement towards more sustainable and self-sufficient communities. Many people are seeking out a simpler way of life, and they're choosing to live in rural areas where they can grow their own food, raise animals, and live closer to nature. When people leave rural areas and migrate to urban centers, it can have a number of impacts on the countryside. One of the most significant impacts is the decline in the population of rural areas. That can lead to a decrease in the demand for goods and services, which can have a negative impact on the local economy. It can also lead to the closure of schools, businesses, and other community institutions, which can have a negative impact on the social fabric of those rural communities. Another impact of people leaving the countryside is the abandonment of farmland. When people leave rural areas, they may leave behind their farms, which can lead to the abandonment of agricultural land. That can have negative environmental consequences, as abandoned land may become overgrown with weeds and may be more prone to erosion and other forms of environmental degradation. Finally, the migration of people from rural areas can lead to a decline in the cultural and social traditions of those areas. As people leave and the population becomes more diverse, traditional ways of life may be lost and replaced by more modern urban customs. This can lead to a loss of cultural heritage and a sense of disconnection from the past. It's common for people living in rural areas to feel neglected by governments and to feel that their needs and concerns are not being adequately addressed. This can be due to a number of factors, including the concentration of political power and economic resources in urban centers, but also the lack of access to quality education and healthcare in rural areas, and the lack of investment in infrastructure and other public services. These feelings of neglect and marginalization can lead to a sense of frustration and resentment among people living in rural areas and can contribute to a shift towards populist politics. Populist politicians often appeal to the grievances and concerns of marginalized groups, including those living in rural areas, and may promise to address their needs and concerns. They may also portray urban elites as out of touch and indifferent to the struggles of ordinary people, and may appeal to a sense of nationalism or patriotism in order to rally support. Depending on how the relationship between the city and the countryside is viewed and expressed, a dichotomy can arise that contributes to creating conflicts rather than a symbiosis between the units. Cities can be seen as the pearls of civilization, cultural, economic, and intellectual strongholds, while the countryside can be seen as a backwards wasteland populated by hicks. Or cities can be seen as dirty, stressful, and dangerous places where decadent and lost souls live, while people in the countryside are honest, down-to-earth, and hard-working, close to nature and family. Such a division into here and there, or us and them, often occurs with political motivation, but it can also arise simply because people tend to be afraid of and opposed to what they don't know. In order for both cities and rural areas to be governed and planned in a sustainable manner, it's important to see them as complementary, not competitors. And to do that, it's important to clarify their relationships to each other in a nuanced way. I will now mention some Swedish examples of newspaper reports as well as academic research on the topic to establish some prevalent views. And then I'll take a closer look at specific terms used to describe the relation between city and countryside. That means an examination of the topic in terms of representation, power dynamics, as well as resource flows. In the report Rural Areas in the Shadow of the Media, the authors investigate how the resources and infrastructure of local journalism are changing and what consequences that can have for local democracy and the media image of Sweden outside the big cities. The report points out how closed or reduced local editorial offices and changing reader behavior affect the media's ability and willingness to report in depth on events outside the big cities. The use of secondary sources and other media as sources increases, and crime news gets more space while reporting on politics and economics decreases. Dagens Nyheter, considered Sweden's newspaper of record, is examined more closely in the report as it's produced in Stockholm, the capital city, but has a nationwide coverage. It's noted that the rural issues addressed primarily concern city dwellers using the countryside as a travel destination. Dagens Nyheter, or DN for short, has a category on their website called City and Countryside. Examples of article headlines are Why It's Terrible to Live in Stockholm, Rural People Become Dangerous When City Dwellers Make Movies, Digital Exclusion in Rural Areas, and The Feeling of Being Left Out in the Countryside Must Be Taken Seriously. Svenska Dagbladet, the conservative competitor of DN, has a category on their website called The Gap Between the City and the Countryside, with articles such as The countryside continues to lose inhabitants, the far-right voters don't hate immigrants, they hate you, Stockholmers, as well as several articles against tax equalization which would support rural settlements. The picture produced by both newspapers is characterized by dichotomy and conflict. Problems are highlighted, but they're very general, as if the Scanian countryside with its farms has the same conditions and needs as the northern, thousands of kilometers away with its forests and rivers. In the researched article Urban Scaling and the Regional Divide, the authors examine the role of cities as growth engines and a typical increase in per capita income of 15%, with the doubling of the city's population. Previous models, they argue, explain the increase through increased population density and therefore increased social exchange. In their own study, they examine what proportion of productivity increase can be attributed to social exchange and which other factors may be decisive. To answer the question, they compared education level, age, and cognitive ability based on IQ tests at conscription for men in Sweden's local labor markets. They found that the population in big cities like Stockholm, Gothenburg, Malmö, and Linköping's labor markets is younger, more educated, and smarter than those in the rest of the country. Furthermore, they found that those who move from low population regions to the big cities are even younger, even more educated, and even smarter. Their conclusion is that an imbalance arises between rural areas and cities in productivity and income, as well as education level, age, and cognitive ability, and that this selective migration accounts for between 39 and 66% of the increased income per capita when a city's population doubles. What this suggests is that cities and their surroundings are not only provided with material resources, but also with human capital in an imbalanced way. However, the study doesn't consider flows in the opposite direction, and is based solely on data from employed men who have undergone conscription. It doesn't include immigration or women. Crucially, it deals with the increased income on a per capita basis, which implies everyone living in cities benefits from their growth, when in fact the wealth tends to be concentrated and prices tend to go up, making them less affordable for many. An opposite view is taken by the report, The Driving Forces and Consequences of Urban Development. It considers it incorrect to view urbanization as happening at the expense of rural areas. The population growth in Swedish cities is mainly due to immigration, high birth rates, and increased life expectancy, not depopulation in rural areas, according to the report. Furthermore, not all rural areas are the same. The report shows population growth in rural areas close to urban centers. Therefore, today's urbanization is very different from previous phases. Regarding unemployment, the statistics show a different picture than what is often reported. On average, it's actually lower in densely populated rural municipalities than in the most populous urban municipalities. What emerges from these examples is that framing and interpretation is crucial to the understanding of the relation between city and countryside, as with any topic. When it comes to resource flows, however, there's a more definite imbalance between cities and their hinterland. The imbalance between cities and their supporting hinterland can be described by calculating a population's average consumption of resources and the productive area needed to support the population and manage its waste. The result is an indicator of the population's ecological footprint. The method can be applied at different scales, from individual to national or even global levels, and by comparing different ecological footprints, the distribution of resources can be clarified. The calculation model includes consumption categories such as food, housing, transportation, consumables, and services, and as productive areas mainly arable land, pasture, and forest land are considered. But the principle can be applied to both more and less complex resource flows. There are different terms such as rural, hinterland, and countryside, often used to describe areas that are outside of urban centers. They have some different connotations, but they're more or less the same. Hinterland refers specifically to land that's located behind a coastal area or a river, hinter in German meaning behind. The term countryside is often used to describe the natural beauty and peacefulness of a rural area, and the term rural is a bit more neutral. There are also different models for viewing the relationship between city and countryside. One of them is the rural-urban transect. The rural-urban transect is a concept used to describe the gradient of land use and development from rural to urban areas. The transect is typically divided into a series of zones, with the most rural areas at one end and the most urban at the other. The zones in between the two extremes represent intermediate levels of development, with each zone having its own distinct characteristics and land use patterns. It's often used as a tool for planning and designing communities and transportation systems. It helps planners understand the different types of land use and development that exist within a region, and how they're distributed across the landscape. That information can be used to guide decisions about the location and design of infrastructure, such as roads, schools, and parks, and to ensure that development is integrated and harmonious with the surrounding landscape. The rural-urban transect can also be used to analyze and understand the social, economic, and environmental impacts of different types of development. For example, it can help planners understand the economic and social benefits of preserving natural areas in the rural zone, as well as the potential impacts of urbanization on the environment and local communities. One issue with the rural-urban transect is this very clear and defined picture of the relationship between city and countryside. In February 2020, AMO and Rem Koolhaas' exhibition The Countryside, the Future was opened at the Guggenheim Museum in New York. It was open for less than a month as the COVID pandemic forced the shutting down of public life, but Taschen released a book of essays, which they called the official companion to the exhibition. In the introduction to Countryside, a report, Koolhaas claims the countryside is largely off our radar, an ignored realm, and that there is no real mutual relationship between city and countryside, nor a definition. There's no doubting Koolhaas' influence on the discourse of architecture and urbanism. Since the co-founding in 1975 of the Office for Metropolitan Architecture, OMA, and the publishing of the Urban Manifesto Delirious New York in 1978, Koolhaas has spent 4 decades preoccupied with projects in, texts about, and studies of metropolitan cities. So the shift of his focus toward what he terms the countryside, his definition, the 98% of the Earth's surface that is not occupied by cities, begs a few questions. Why now? In the book, the reason given is the 2007 UN announcement that half of the world's population lives in cities, which supposedly caused a hyper-focus on urbanization. In the press release for the exhibition, it stated that it was the 2014 UN report, including the same statistic, which meant the other half of the global population was subsequently ignored, something the exhibition sought to rectify. In Koolhaas' own words, though, I'm interested in the country for the same reason I was paying attention to New York in the 70s. No one else was looking. But the exhibition and the book themselves contradict his statement, showcasing a range of initiatives outside of cities, such as the Tahoe Reno Industrial Center, which Koolhaas writes about in the book. It's home to the world's largest building, the Tesla Gigafactory 1, and the Google Data Storage Campus. So why the countryside? Perhaps a look into Koolhaas's previous text can prove enlightening. In the addendum to Dolores, New York, Koolhaas concludes, "The metropolis strives to reach a mythical point where the world is completely fabricated by man, so that it absolutely coincides with his desires. The metropolis is an addictive machine, from which there is no escape, unless it offers that too. Through its pervasiveness, its existence has become like the nature it has replaced, taken for granted, almost invisible, certainly indescribable." And on page 247, below a portrait of Le Corbusier, Koolhaas quotes him, "In times of danger, the sheep must go where others aren't." In Small, Medium, Large and Extra Large, published in 1995, Koolhaas wrote in the essay Bigness, or the Problem of Large, that bigness, through its very independence of context, is the one architecture that can survive, even exploit the now global condition of the tabula rasa. It gravitates opportunistically to locations of maximum infrastructural promise. It's finally its own raison d'être. It appears Rem Koolhaas writes very much in self-reference. Stretching that theory, when he writes the countryside is off our radar, it means it's off his radar. When he writes there's no real mutual relationship between it and the city, he means it and himself. Koolhaas is the metropolis striving to reach a mythical point where the world is completely fabricated by him, so it absolutely coincides with his desires. He is the sheaf who must go where others aren't, and his bigness, gravitating opportunistically to locations of maximum promise. Therefore, the countryside. The point of bringing all that up is to again highlight how topics can be framed and discourse led to fit an agenda. It's something worth keeping in mind amid the cacophony of buzzwords within architectural and planning communication, from greenwashing to the dogma of urban density. There are a number of incentives that politicians and policymakers might offer to encourage people to move to or stay in rural areas. Governments might offer financial incentives, such as tax breaks or grants, to businesses or individuals who move to rural areas in order to stimulate economic development in those areas. To fight depopulation and desertification of rural areas, some countries like Italy, Portugal, Japan, or Ireland offer people money to move back to the countryside. In Italy, for example, Precise, located in Puglia, supports people wanting to buy a house and relocate there with up to 30,000 euros. There's also an incentive called the €1 houses. It refers to an Italian government initiative aimed at selling abandoned properties in various Italian regions for just €1. The idea behind the initiative is to regenerate declining towns and villages by attracting new residents, tourists, and investment. The properties being sold are often in need of renovation and restoration, but the low price point is meant to encourage individuals and families to invest time and money in the restoration and redevelopment of these properties. Municipalities expect to revitalize the local economy through such initiatives. In addition to economic incentives, there might be infrastructure improvements. Governments might invest in infrastructure improvements, such as building or upgrading roads, schools, and hospitals, in order to make those areas more attractive to potential residents. There's an inequality when it comes to how developed the infrastructure is in the countryside compared to cities. As rural settlements are less dense compared to cities, it's less feasible for extensive public transportation systems to be established. Therefore, people in rural areas have limited transportation options and may need to drive a car to access essential services, work, or other activities. They're often being implicitly criticized and disproportionately financially punished through taxes for driving, even though they don't have a lot of alternatives. There are also quality of life improvements. Governments might also invest in amenities and services that improve the quality of life in rural areas, such as recreational facilities, cultural programs, or other things in order to make those areas more appealing. There are also workforce development programs. A majority of the doctors with practices in rural areas of Germany, for example, are struggling to find replacements after their retirement and having to close. That represents a challenge both for them but also for the politicians, because they can't offer a sufficient supply of healthcare for the population, which in turn leads to more people moving away from the countryside. As an incentive for young doctors to move or to stay in the countryside of Germany, there are various funding programs to support them in opening a practice, such as Lass dich nieder or Settle Down. In terms of future outlooks, things will probably change quite a lot in the coming years. We've seen during the pandemic how remote work is an increased possibility. It's being ended in some offices, and it brings issues of its own in terms of isolation and co-worker atmosphere. But it might enable more people to move to the countryside. There's also the fact that most cities are rapidly getting too expensive. So what do? Do you just stay in collectives, or do you actually at some point have to move out of the city? It'll be interesting to see how the discourse changes moving forward. Maybe Rem Koolhaas was really onto something. In any case, this has been an examination of the discourse on cities and their surroundings, hopefully adding some nuance to the issue. Let's talk about cities and the countryside.